And good evening. Tonight, with just 11 days until the presidential election, both candidates campaigning not in key battleground states, but in an unusual territory, Ruby Red, Texas. It's a star-powered showdown in the Lone Star State. Vice President Kamala Harris teaming up with music superstar Beyonce for a rally in Houston to bring abortion back into the spotlight, while former President Trump sits down with chart-topping podcaster Joe Rogan, hoping his millions of listeners will help put him over the top. Texas is also home to one of the most heated Senate contests in the election. Democratic Congressman Colin Allred challenging Republican Senator Ted Cruz. Allred will join Harris on stage tonight as his campaign gains some momentum in the long-shot race. Right now, a New York Times Siena College poll has Harris and Trump tied. The two deadlock 48% to 48%, all within the margin of error. And a significant move from the media world sparking backlash this evening. The Washington Post announcing it would not be endorsing anyone for president. An article by two Post reporters saying the paper's owner, billionaire Jeff Bezos, blocked a draft endorsement for Vice President Harris from being published. Plus, breaking tonight, the FBI now investigating after Chinese hackers allegedly targeted phones used by both campaigns, including former President Trump. We start tonight with NBC's Priscilla Thompson, who is in Houston at that Harris event tonight. Priscilla, what is the atmosphere like there tonight?
Yeah, Tom, the energy is electric. I don't know if you can hear, but the crowd just now broke out into cheers, and we've seen that happening every so often here as people are slowly making their way inside of the stadium. There are kids down on the ground dancing and running around, and this is incredible because some of these people have been in line since 5 o'clock in the morning, so they stood outside of the stadium for hours hoping for a chance to get in here. And I will tell you, it is late October in Texas, but it is hot. It was at least 80 degrees outside, and that is what people were willing to wait through. Right now, the stadium is only about halfway full, so there's still a lot more people to get in here, but that line was wrapped for blocks around and through parking lots and all kinds of things. And you can hear the crowd getting excited as they're revving them up here for things to get underway. I will tell you, there have been signs on the screens over the past couple hours, and the messaging is very simple. It is freedom, it is reproductive freedom, and it is urging people to get out and vote. And one other thing I will note about this crowd, it has really turned out the Democratic base, and that is black women. There are so many black women throughout this crowd who have turned out tonight, perhaps to hear from Vice President Harris, perhaps to enjoy that performance from Beyonce, but they're certainly trying to keep the crowd engaged here. But lots of folks still keeping that energy up even after a long day of waiting. Tom?
Yeah, Priscilla, explain to our viewers here, because this is, of course, about what the Harris campaign wants to put out there in Texas. It's also about that closely watched Senate race.
Oh, I see you upstairs.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Texas is known as a red state. Right now, Trump is up outside of the margin of error. So it's not that Harris is coming to here necessarily with the hopes of winning the state of Texas, but her message is really a larger one about this being ground zero for the abortion fight. And the idea that if people do not get out and vote and elect people like Colin Allred, who is running to unseat Ted Cruz, that we could see abortion laws like this going into effect across the country. And we have excerpts of some of what she is expected to say, which is expected to include, for anyone watching from another state, if you think you are protected from Trump abortion bans because you live in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, New York, California, or any state where voters or legislators have protected reproductive freedom, please know that no one is protected. And tonight we are expected to hear from some of those women in Texas who have harrowing stories of needing to get care whenever they were not able to carry pregnancies. Tom?
Okay, Priscilla Thompson first. Priscilla, we thank you for that. We do want to move on now and continue our coverage with both campaigns on the ground in the Lone Star State today. We want to take a deeper dive into some of the changes, and we also want to talk to Garrett Hake, who's on the campaign trail in Texas.
Tonight, former President Trump in Texas, flanked by Border Patrol agents and victims of crimes police say were committed by undocumented immigrants, going after Vice President Harris over her expected rally here with Beyonce.
Today, Kamala is here in Texas to rub shoulders with woke celebrities. Isn't that exciting? But she's not going to meet with any of the victims of migrant crime.
Overnight, Trump amping up his attacks on the administration's border policies, arguing they turned America into a, quote, garbage can.
When Kamala came in, she deliberately dismantled our border and threw open the gates. We're a dumping ground. We're like a We're like a garbage can for the world.
Harris firing back.
You know, it's just another example of how he really belittles our country.
While Trump today denying the claim by his former chief of staff, John Kelly, that he fits the definition of a fascist.
There was phony stories by a general that got fired. When you fire people for doing a bad job, they get a little bit angry.
And slamming Harris for repeating them.
But she did call me a fascist, and everyone knows that's not true. They call me everything until, something sticks.
Trump also using his visit to Austin to record an interview with popular podcaster Joe Rogan, whose audience includes many of the politically disengaged young men the former president's campaign hopes to turn into Trump voters. And while Harris has the advantage with young voters overall, a new NBC News Gen Z poll shows among young men, Trump is only down by 2 points, within the margin of error.
I don't trust Kamala to run this country.
We spoke to new Trump supporters at Arizona State.
I like his policy on closed borders, and I don't like illegal immigration. He talks like I talk with my friends.
Aiden Garth is a regular Joe Rogan listener and voted early for Trump.
If people sit down and actually watch the full long-term interview, I think they'll see more kind of who Trump is, kind of not the evil guy that everyone makes him out to be.
Meanwhile, Trump is facing an allegation of groping from former model Stacey Williams, who says it happened more than 30 years ago in Trump Tower when Jeffrey Epstein brought her to see Trump.
Just as soon as Donald saw us, his arms were around me and he pulled me into him, and then the groping started. And I just froze.
Williams is a Democrat who first told her story publicly this week on a Zoom call, Survivors for Kamala. NBC News spoke to 7 people who said Williams had told them about it between 2006 and 2022. The Trump campaign notes the accusation came 2 weeks before the election and says it is, quote, unequivocally false.
Garrett Haake joins us tonight from the campaign trail in Austin, Texas. Garrett, we're going to switch gears now from that allegation to some new reporting that NBC News has now confirmed concerning China possibly targeting the cell phones of Senator J.D. Vance and the former president.
That's right, Tom. NBC News has confirmed that these hackers, apparently Chinese, targeted both presidential campaigns, the Harris campaign and the phones of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. The Trump campaign responding in a statement today suggesting that the hack is caused by the administration's weakness towards China, trying to take something in which they were targeted and turn it around to make it a weakness for the Harris campaign and for the Biden administration. I tried to ask Trump about this directly today, whether or not his phone specifically was targeted and whether or not he'd been briefed. No response, Tom, but I suspect we've not heard the last of this story.
All right, Garrett Haake for us. Garrett, we appreciate it. With both campaigns on the ground in the Lone Star State today, we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the changes we're seeing in the Texas electorate and how they could impact this year's race with a week and a half to go until Election Day. Okay, so first things first, we want to give you a little bit of history here. We do want to be clear. The history here does not exactly favor Democrats. The last Democratic presidential nominee to win Texas was Jimmy Carter back in 1976. And they haven't won a statewide office, Democrats, in 30 years. But here's a plus for the Democrats. Texas is a majority-minority state, with about 40% of the state now Latino, and those minority populations are some of the ones growing the fastest. Let me show you where, and let me show you why this is so important for Democrats here. When we look at a state like Texas, a huge portion of the population and the vote comes from the Houston metro area. When we look at Harris County, which is the biggest county in all of Texas, Joe Biden wins here. But what I want you to look at here is the path of how he wins and the rate. 49 to 54 from Obama to Clinton. It goes all the way up to 56, where in 2012, look at this number. You had Republicans at 49% in Harris County. They went down to 41. They increased a little bit in 2020. And then we look at a neighboring county, a county like Fort Bend right here, and it's almost the same. You have a flip from Romney to Clinton, and then you can see Obama flips to Trump, and then Trump kind of trends a little bit down. So you can see the Democratic counties there are opening up and they're getting a little bigger. As we move to Dallas, it's kind of same story. Obama 57, Clinton 60. Again, the Democrats are growing here. Biden at 65. And just next door, Fort Worth, this used to be Republican territory. George W. Bush won this county. It was a place where Republicans could loyally win year after year. Look at Romney, 57. Trump goes down to 41. Biden flips it in the last election. But it's not all bad news, obviously, in Texas. Look at all this red for Republicans. And if you go down south to the border, there are some interesting things happening here for Republicans. This is Webb County here. Again, Democrats won, but let me show you the trend here. It's a little different. The trend is getting better for Republicans. It goes from 22.6 with Romney. You jump over to 2020, he's up to nearly 40%. And if we come out of here just a second, let me switch out of here. This is a smaller county, Zapata County. But as we look at this, it's actually a county that they were able to flip from 65 to 52. So a lot's happening in Texas. And because of that, we want to take a deeper dive and talk to one of the foremost experts in this state. And before we do that, I want to show you one more thing. It's where the polls stand here. This is, let's see, let's go to the polls right here. So for president, it's pretty tied up. This is an average of the Real Clear Politics polls right here. Trump at 51, Harris at 45. Republicans look to be okay there. But look at the Senate race here. And this is why Kamala Harris is in Texas right now. This is why she's there with Beyonce. Cruz at 49.6, Allred at 45.4. This is getting even closer. And you can remember the race that he had about 6 years ago, Senator Ted Cruz. He nearly lost that one to Beto O'Rourke. It was very close as well. For more on how this year's elections could go in the Lone Star State, I want to bring in one of the best Texas gurus around, as I mentioned, who has been helping us prepare for election night, Dr. James Henson. He's director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas in Austin. Dr. Henson, thanks so much for joining Top Story tonight. Does Vice President Harris have a chance in Texas?
Well, you know, you can't say she has much of a chance. She's got a big gap to overcome, as you can see historically. But I think the story of the Harris campaign in a lot of ways is to see Kamala Harris in this historical trajectory of the state that you were talking about. If we go back, the gap in presidential elections between the Republican and the Democrat has been shrinking pretty steadily over the last few elections. It was looking like that trend would be reversed by Joe Biden because his numbers were so bad in Texas in the spring and the early summer. Her replacement seems to have put Texas back on a path towards being more competitive, though it probably won't get there this year.
So let me ask you about the Senate race right now. Is Senator Ted Cruz in trouble?
Well, I think Ted Cruz is in a position where he can't be complacent, and they have to keep working. I think the polling average that you just showed captures something important about the race, and that's that it's been moving around a lot. We did polling at the University of Texas in early October that had that race at about 7 points, but it's been moving around and closing, and so I think if there's one lesson that Ted Cruz learned in 2018, it's that you can't be asleep at the switch. And I think you're seeing the Cruz campaign work pretty hard, raise a lot of money, spend a lot of money. And you're seeing Colin Allred at this point keeping them on that path because he's keeping it close.
Yeah, and it was about a 3% difference in that race in 2018 between Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke, as we mentioned earlier. We know that Texas is growing, especially in the blue areas of the state, as I was showing in Dallas and Houston. Are the red rural areas growing as well, or is it mostly just those Democratic strongholds?
No, in fact, the red rural areas are losing population, just like rural areas in a lot of areas of the country. And this is what part of the dynamic that we're seeing at work in the Senate race is. That is, Republicans know that the state is becoming gradually, but still clearly more competitive, and that their strongholds are becoming less populated and forming a smaller share of the electorate. So they're beginning to look in other areas for smaller slices of votes to make up for the ground that they're losing in the major urban areas, which is, you know, where a big share of the population is in the state.
In places like Waco, in places like Austin, in places like Brownsville down by the border, Elon Musk has played a huge role in bringing jobs to Texas. Is his sort of side-by-side role there with former President Trump, is that helping Trump in Texas in any way?
Well, I think it's a little bit hard to tell. I think it probably is, in the sense that Elon Musk's public political profile that he's relatively recently embraced with such vigor is much more aligned with what we're seeing in the modern Republican Party in the state. It's populist. It's, has a shade of nativism in it in terms of his views of immigration. And that is going to put him much closer, align him much closer with Donald Trump, with the more conservative Republicans in the state. And in terms of this dynamic that we're talking about, to the extent that Trump does appeal to this kind of populist, more masculine, kind of younger male audience, it's likely to be helpful, and I think we're seeing Republican political leadership in the state respond that way.
Finally, I was showing some trend lines, right, in the southern portion of Texas, right there on the border, in those counties around Laredo that seem to be, there's still blue counties, we can see that right now, but one flipped is a very small county, but others seem to be trending Republican. Are Democrats, do they have trouble down here with Hispanics near the border?
Well, I think in some of those areas they do have trouble, and it comes from a couple of different places. To some extent, it ties back to something we were talking about a couple minutes ago, which is the sensibility, the political sensibility of rural areas in Texas. Many of those border counties are very rural, and what we're seeing more and more is that rural Hispanics vote like a lot of their neighbors and trend in a more conservative direction. And that is something that Democrats have to deal with in these South Texas counties, along with, the decay of the political networks that held Democratic political officials, in their positions in those states. Some of those old school networks along the border are decaying, and Republicans are trying to take advantage of that.
Okay, Doctor, we appreciate you having you here on the show tonight, as always. Another election headline we're following in a major departure from election tradition. The Washington Post announcing today they will not be endorsing a presidential candidate. The move, the first in 36 years. The Post CEO, William Lewis, writing in an op-ed, the Washington Post will not be making an endorsement of a presidential candidate in this election, nor in any future presidential elections. We are returning to our roots of not endorsing presidential candidates. The reason for the decision, according to the Washington Post, is Jeff Bezos, the paper's owner, staff reporters writing, an endorsement of Harris had been drafted by Post editorial page staffers, but had yet to be published, according to two sources briefed on the sequence of events. The decision not to publish was made by the Post's owner, Amazon founder, Jeff Bezos. Let's bring in NPR's media correspondent, David Folkenflik. David, thanks so much for joining us. I know you've done a lot of great reporting about the Washington Post. Talk to me about why this is such a significant story, in your opinion, right? Because what Will Lewis is saying there is essentially, listen, we don't want to choose sides. We're going to go back to our tradition of not endorsing a candidate. But the Washington Post's own reporting says it's a little different than that. The publisher, who is a billionaire, who has outside business interests, made this call. Is that your understanding? Is that a fair framing of what's happened?
Yes, Tom, to be fair, we've reported that some hours ago as well, that this was in process. The editorial page editor sent it up the chain of command for approval. And let's be clear, this is the prerogative, absolutely, of publishers or CEOs of newspapers and of their bosses, the owners of a newspaper, to be able to weigh in and decide that. Such consultation is common, and it's not newsroom interference in the way that's understood. On the other hand, just as you said, there's a greater context for this. And there are two that I want to offer you. One is the context that, former President Trump, both in office and on the campaign trail this year, has made it clear that he is willing to and eager to exact vengeance against news organizations, including your own, that he perceives or says that he perceives to have crossed him or been unfair to him in their business operations. And in fact, that Jeff Bezos, who in many ways has been an exemplary owner in the more than a decade he has been over the Washington Post, not interfering with its coverage of his business interests, nonetheless has a ton of business before the federal government. Amazon, of course, is deeply affected by what shipping rates are charged by the U.S. Postal Service to his core business, at the business he founded at Amazon, of bringing things to all of our doors, particularly in this post-pandemic times. He has an enormous, more than, I believe, $2 billion cloud computing services contract with the U.S. Department of Defense. And with Blue Origin, his space company, he does significant business with NASA as well. And so, there is this question in this neck and neck race with between former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris just about 10 days before Americans have their final day to vote on this on Election Day in early November. The Post is announcing out of the blue that as a matter of principle, it's returning to roots that it has not embraced for many decades. And in fact, let's give you one more little twist. This very question was raised by Bezos's first publisher, or the publisher that he first hired, Fred Ryan, a former Republican figure in Washington, who wasn't comfortable with Hillary Clinton in 2016, didn't want to endorse her when she was facing against Donald Trump in that first Trump bid for the White House. And Fred Hyatt, then the editorial page editor of the newspaper, basically considered resigning. When he said to Bezos, you know, if and when we endorse, I'd like it to be Hillary Clinton, Bezos' response was, why shouldn't we do an endorsement? Why wouldn't we do an endorsement? So what you're seeing is a reversal here. You know, Bezos himself suffered his business interests suffered in the first Trump administration, where it appeared likely that Amazon was going to win a $10 billion contract from the Defense Department, from the Pentagon, and they gave it to Microsoft instead. Amazon filed suit. A judge allowed that suit to proceed, and ultimately the Pentagon had to break that contract up into a bunch of parts, giving a smaller portion of it to Amazon. But, you know, Bezos may feel that this is not worth the lift, as many of his staffers are saying to me today. Of course, Will Lewis, as you said, presented this as a matter of principle, but, you know, more than 1,600 people canceled their digital subscriptions in the first 3 hours after I broke news of this almost a little before midday today.
1,600?
Yeah.
That's staggering for a paper.
Yeah,
and David, you know, a lot of our viewers may not know the ins and outs of the Washington Post like we do, because it is part of our industry. They are having a tough time to begin with. Will Lewis was brought in to turn around the paper, because even though they sort of had I wouldn't say a renaissance during the Trump years, they did have a subscription uptick, and then that went down, and they've been losing a lot of money. To lose 1,500 subscriptions just in today with that reporting, that's devastating for them.
Oh, it's a huge blow. It's much greater than even the most mild protests seem to generate in that short a time. You know, I think it would have been fair to say that the newspaper experienced both the reporting and a financial renaissance during the Trump years. It was very good for business, so much so that folks were a little concerned that it might have been distorting for the incentives for the newspaper. Nonetheless, you know, what you're seeing now is Jeff Bezos did bring in Will Lewis. The newspaper had lost a couple of years ago more than $100 million in a year, $77 million according to Will Lewis last year. It's on track to lose $50 million this year after a lot of buyouts. But Will Lewis was brought in, I'm told, from sources inside the Post for another reason as well. What was that? Well, he knows how to deal with conservative power bases. He worked for Rupert Murdoch as Murdoch's publisher of the Wall Street Journal for 6 years and had been an executive for a number of years before. He had been the editor-in-chief of The Telegraph in London, which is considered a major basis of support for the conservative Tory party there. And he had served as a consultant after leaving the Wall Street Journal for conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson for a brief time while Johnson was there. You know, Johnson, a leading figure in the Tory party as well. So, you know, Lewis brings all these bona fides of how to deal with powerful conservative figures, and Bezos brought him in part in anticipation of the potential that Donald Trump might well be returning to office. Well, we have essentially a coin flip coming up early next month, and here Bezos and Will Lewis are announcing essentially a decision to hold off. And the key thing is an editorial was being drafted. It had already been set in favor of Vice President Harris. So we knew what direction the Post was going to land, and it was consistent with its aggressive reporting and with the stances taken by the separately operated editorial page, which had declared Trump repeatedly unfit for service, particularly after what he did surrounding the acts to try to deny President Biden the certification of his win in early January of 2021.
David, I do want to ask you, though, and all that reporting is very important for the context, but the decision, say the decision was honorable and they decided they wanted to stop choosing sides, stop making endorsements. There was a similar incident at the LA Times, again, because of the publisher from the reporting by the LA Times as well. But if this were a strategy move, is it a bad idea if papers maybe stop endorsing? Is it the worst idea?
Well, let's stipulate a few things. First, owners and publishers have every right to say they're not going to make endorsements. Secondly, you know, the American public's trust in the media is close to, or if possibly at, an all-time low.
And that's why I asked you that
indeed.
question, because take this Bezos element out of it, and obviously we can't because of this, it's actually not a bad idea, right?
Well, certainly major newspapers across the country have done this. You've seen a number of newspapers owned by major financial investment banks and the like decide to pull away from it as a way of saying, we don't want figures to feel as though we're taking sides. We want to reflect your voices and let you decide. There are ways in which that feels more like the news side's role in things, is to, not call balls and strikes perhaps, but not to say which side you're cheering for, if any, really not to cheer for a side. Yeah. But I think it's a perfectly legitimate stance to take, and the Arizona Republic is among those that has done so. To do it 10 days before the election, to do it when your board has already drafted or is in the process of drafting an editorial, which is exactly what happened at the Los Angeles Times as well, smacks of deciding that you don't want the outcome.
Yes, it smacks of meddling. It's what it sounds like.
Well, look, they are entitled. Again, it's their newspapers. Patrick Soon-Shiong, the billionaire inventor and physician who owns the LA Times, is entitled to do this. But he's doing it in a way which says, I'm smashing this and preventing it from happening. And I have interests that are leading me to do that. It doesn't feel like a journalistic interest and impulse. Announce it 6 months ago. Right. Announce it even 6 weeks ago. But, you want to do that before the nominees are settled. So you're making a choice not to choose before you know who you're choosing among, because you're doing it on principle.
And I say meddle because, this is one issue, right? And you could say, oh, this is one time that the publisher steps in. Well, maybe there's another issue in 6 months and the publisher wants to step in again. And you're right. Hey, listen, it's their paper. They bought it. It's their rules. It's their party, their rules. They can do whatever they want. That being said, you can't lose the trust of your consumers, of your readers. And secondly, you can't confuse them, right, David? Because if they're confused, then they're definitely not going to read you.
Well, and look at the response you're seeing inside the paper. Forget the newsroom for the moment. But again, the separately run, the opinion pages, you're seeing the resignation of one of their top longest serving columnists, Robert Kagan, their editor at large. He confirmed to me and to others today that he had resigned, within a couple hours of this being disclosed to the staff. And he's been a figure who has time and again written about the threat that he believes Trump poses as an autocrat in waiting, somebody increasingly authoritarian, someone admiring of other dictators and willing to impose such a tight grip on policy in this country, which is more supposedly defined by checks and balances and by the accountability provided by journalists, both in newsrooms, but also opinion journalists. They have expanded the remit of the editorial and opinion sections of the Post to be much broader and textualized to be more appealing to an audience who cares very much about national and international issues. Yep. What I've heard from inside the Post is that they're concerned this is a failure to state principles at a time that matters.
David, I got to wrap because we have some breaking news out of Israel and Iran. I thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really great conversation. We hope to have you back in. We are following, as I just said, breaking news out of the Middle East. Israel has begun conducting retaliatory strikes against Iran. A senior Arab official and Iranian state media say several explosions have been reported near Tehran. Syrian state media reporting the Syrian air defenses have targeted enemy air forces in the air. We're going to continue to monitor and update as we get more. As soon as we get video, as soon as we get pictures, and our reporters on the ground have confirmed more information, we're going to bring that to you live. Right now, all we can tell you is that it sounds like and it feels like this retaliatory strike from Israel on Iran has started once again. Once we get more information, we're going to come right back to it. We do want to stay on politics tonight and the race for president. A group of voters who could make a huge difference this election are Gen Z voters. A new NBC News Stay Tuned poll finds the majority of the young voters think the country is heading in the wrong direction. But will they make their voices heard and turn up to vote? And could the large amount of political content flooding TikTok move that needle? NBC's Savannah Sellers takes a closer look.
I'm a never Trump guy.
Across TikTok, political content is flooding feeds like never before.
Did you vote? Are you gonna vote? Will you vote for me?
Posts about Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump racking up 1.4 and 1.3 billion views, according to social media analytics company Zelf. Whether they're informational,
Donald Trump and Kamala Harris just met for the very first time,
or satirical.
No.
Those videos likely to get in front of what could be a critical voting bloc this election, Gen Z, which made up nearly 45% of U.S. users on TikTok in 2023, according to market research company eMarketer.
TikTok is such a powerful tool. And I think
TikToker Melinda Hale first started posting during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Okay, real talk. Let's talk about the difference between what Kamala Harris wants to do for black men and what Trump wants to do.
Her videos now often break down issues such as racial justice, reproductive health care, and climate change.
And I love being able to use my platform and use my voice to explain things that I care about in a way that is digestible for my followers and in a way that helps them understand, specifically with like policies that are happening and things to vote on for this election.
Welcome back, Patriots.
Some Gen Z TikTokers, like conservative creator Heaven Angel, trying to reach their peers.
As a Gen Z conservative, I'm going to tell you 3 reasons why I'm voting for Trump.
She says her content reaches users on both ends of the political spectrum. Her message to the TikTok generation, one of unity.
I think you're going to see within our generation people that want to actually come together and find solutions rather than having problems to be able to campaign about, because we're sick and tired of this.
According to a new NBC News Stay Tuned poll of 18 to 29-year-olds powered by SurveyMonkey, 77% of young voters believe the country is on the wrong track, up 10 points from August. The big question, will this generation turn out to vote? 58% say they will.
I don't know what's wrong with you young people. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
Both the Harris and Trump campaigns turning to TikTok to try to turn out the vote, posting TikToks of campaign stops.
President Trump! Well, that's a good-looking group. Hello, everybody.
And embracing viral trends.
What is your name as a group?
The Click.
That direct messaging, a way to reach voters on an app that has banned all political ads since 2019. But nonprofit Global Witness says it was able to get several ads with political disinformation approved by TikTok, raising questions about how well the platform is able to filter its content. A TikTok spokesperson telling us 4 ads were incorrectly approved during the first stage of moderation, but did not run on our platform. We do not allow political advertising and will continue to enforce this policy on an ongoing basis.
Make some noise for my very good friend, Elon Musk. Muskie. He has a lot of money, but not as much money as me.
The type of content users are consuming on TikTok could prove critical.
We were trying to see, well, maybe this is all just trivializing politics. Maybe this isn't really very informative or useful. We really didn't know what we would find.
Researchers at Loyola Marymount University say the platform is motivating people to participate in politics, from watching more videos to donating and volunteering with campaigns in a way no other social media has.
So I was surprised to see that it was actually seemingly having the effect of mobilizing people to take part in political action, which we say we want them to do.
Go vote. Love y'all. Bye.
Savannah Sellers, NBC News.
We have a little bit more information about those ongoing retaliatory strikes from Israel on Iran, Lebanon, and apparently Syria as well. This is from the IDF. We've just gotten this in response to months of continuous attacks from the regime in Iran against the state of Israel. Right now, the Israel Defense Force is conducting precise strikes on military targets in Iran. The regime in Iran, again, this is from the IDF, and its proxies in the region have been relentlessly attacking Israel since October 7th on 7 fronts, including direct attacks from Iranian soil. I'm going to pause right now for an NBC News special report.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good evening. We're coming on the air with breaking news and what appears to be a major escalation in the Middle East tonight. Iranian state TV is reporting there have been explosions on targets in Tehran. It comes just weeks after Iran launched a direct missile attack on Israel. This escalation comes amid growing concerns about a wider all-out war breaking in the region. I want to bring in our Pentagon correspondent, Courtney Kube. Courtney, what are you hearing from there?
Yeah, so this is something that we've been waiting for several weeks now, and this is an Israeli military response to the large-scale attack by Iran several weeks ago on Israel. Now, Iran on that night launched nearly 200 ballistic missiles towards Israel, several of them striking. Fortunately, the majority of them were able to be intercepted by the Israeli military with some help from the U.S. military. But since then, we have been hearing from U.S. and Israeli officials that it responds response was coming. Well, that seems to be what is now underway. The Israeli Defense Forces now confirming that they are conducting precision strikes against Iran. Now, in a statement from the IDF, they are saying this is not only in response to that attack several weeks ago by Iran, but this is in a response or retaliation for the dozens and dozens of attacks that they say they have been suffering from Iran and Iranian proxies since October 7th. Now, of course, we have now seen several cases where Israel and Iran have launched projectiles, missiles, drones, and other projectiles and weapons back and forth between one another. Back in April, we saw hundreds of projectiles fly from Iran towards Israel. Again, in that case, the vast majority were knocked down. Israel responding with several strikes up towards Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, that seemed to end the direct back and forth between Iran and Israel. And instead, in those months between April and now, we saw the majority of the attacks came through those proxy networks. So we're talking about Hezbollah from Iran, Hezbollah in Iraq and in Syria, and then, of course, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. But then in July, after a series of Israeli assassinations, the back and forth started again. And then, of course, when Israel assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, it all ticked up again. So the big question here is, Lester, what is Israel targeting tonight? Now, U.S. officials have told us that they expect the majority of the targeting to be against Iranian military sites. But, of course, there is always the possibility that Israel could also go after some of Iran's energy facilities. So things like their oil and gas fields, the sorts of targets that would not necessarily be military related, but could have a direct impact on Iran's economy. It still stands to reason we have to see exactly what they're targeting tonight. But according to U.S. officials, who I will say we have been asking about this every single day since Iran fired off those ballistic missiles against Israel several weeks ago, we have been asking, and we keep hearing one consistent thing. The expectation is Israel will respond, they will retaliate, and they will go after Iranian military targets, Lester.
Courtney, the U.S., as you recall, used some of its interceptors to take down some of those Iranian missiles that hit Israel a couple of weeks ago. Do we know if there's an American involvement tonight?
We don't. So as of now, that does not look to be the case, but this is all really developing quickly here. Now, the U.S. has not only maintained that presence of air defense systems, most of those coming from the maritime several weeks ago. So this was the U.S. Navy firing off interceptors from some of their ships in the Mediterranean to stop some of those incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. But since that time, the U.S. has added another very powerful capability in the form of a THAAD air defense system. Now, that moved into Israel over the course of about 2 weeks. The interceptors are there. The reason that these are so critical to Israel's defense right now, Lester, is because they target an incoming projectile, in most cases a missile, in the terminal phase of its firing. So that's as it is literally heading straight in the last moments before a missile will impact in Israel. The THAAD will launch off and fire it off. It's what the military calls a kinetic kill vehicle. That means it's an interceptor that fires up. It doesn't have a warhead on it. It literally slams into an incoming missile, and then it causes the missile to essentially blow itself up with just that kinetic force. The U.S. has moved that THAAD interceptor, the battery, into Israel, so that should, in fact, if this becomes another tit for tat in the coming hours or even days, Israel will have even more air defense systems in place for a possible Iranian response here.
All right, Courtney, we'll ask you to stand by for those just joining us. We're following events right now in Iran where explosions have been reported, according to state TV there, widely thought to be part of a retaliation by Israel against Iran. I want to go to Matt Bradley now. He's in Beirut. What is the anticipation of what comes next in Lebanon?
Yeah, I mean, all of this is about anticipation, right, Lester? I mean, the fact is that we're talking about Israeli attacks against Iran, and this is when we talk about this IDF statement, they're talking about Iran's proxies, and that is one of the main proxies that is here in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and the Israelis have expanded their front against Hezbollah here for the past month. They've been relentlessly attacking Hezbollah targets here, and the question is whether or not these attacks by Israel against Iran Iran are going to metastasize to encompass the entire region, and whether or not this is going to really work into an entire region-wide war. And that is the real concern here. That's one of the things that American diplomats have been working so hard over the past several weeks to try to avoid, to try to get the entire region to step down from a region-wide war. Now, they've been trying to tell the Israelis to try to stop from, making this into a region-wide war. But the fact is that the main cat's paw of the Iranians is here in Lebanon. And this is why the Israelis have been launching a ground invasion of Lebanon, and that has been, obviously killing so many people in this region, especially here in Lebanon. And so we're trying to see whether or not this is going to be a war that is going to be worked through the Iranians themselves, or whether or not this is going to be more of a symbolic attack, as we saw back in April, when there was more of a tit-for-tat between the Iranians and the Israelis, and both sides were able to climb down with kind of a face-saving maneuver, whether there was more of a symbolic attack. This is now going to be a question of whether or not proxy groups here in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, as we heard from Courtney Kubi, in Yemen and other places throughout the Middle East, are going to now be engaged in fighting against the Israelis. That is going to determine where this war goes from here. Lester?
And Matt, whether we call this the wider war or not, the fact is that Israel is fighting right now on three fronts: in Gaza, in Beirut, and now this attack, which may be limited, but nonetheless it is a third front for Israel.
Yeah, this is the third front. The Israelis, in their statement today, called this the seventh front. I mean, they've been calling this, they've been saying that they've been fighting on 7 fronts. This is really the main front here. Well, when we talk about what the Iranians are doing against the Israelis, they have different groups, what they call the axis of resistance. Now, the axis of resistance is Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah here in Lebanon, they have the Houthis in Yemen, and you can also say that they have the regime of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. This is something that could really metastasize into a much wider war. And that's why we've been seeing this flurry of diplomacy throughout the entire region for the past several weeks, trying, as we've seen from several visits from diplomats from the United States and really throughout the world, trying to get everybody to back down. But it really is a question of whether or not this war by the Israelis is going to be actually escalating the situation or causing everybody to, kind of take a face-saving step back. And that is what we're waiting to see.
All right, Matt Brandler, we'll ask you to stand by there in Beirut as we try to put the pieces together, what we know. I want to go back to the Pentagon, our correspondent Courtney Kubi. Courtney, there was a leak of a U.S. leak of Israeli intelligence data about how they would conduct a retaliatory strike. Do we know, has that altered what they might be doing, or how has it played a role in all this?
So U.S. officials have said that hasn't had any real impact on the situation here. And what's critical about those documents, Lester, is they not only showed how the IDF, the Israeli military, is postured for a possible response to Iran, but they also showed the offensive and the defensive posture. So what was really important about those documents is they showed this sort of holistic look at how the Israeli military was readying for this back and forth with Iran. Now, we are learning a little bit more as this develops. There is, at this point, there is no indication that the U.S. military was involved in this in any way, but that's one of the big questions we have. Again, we're still trying to figure out what the targets were here, Lester.
All right, Courtney Kubi, again, we're watching this activity in Iran tonight. Explosions reported, likely a retaliatory strike by Israel. That concludes this NBC News special report. Much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCnews.com. And tonight on NBC Nightly News, I'm Lester Holt in New York. Thank you for watching and good evening.
And we've been following that breaking news out of the Middle East. Israel has begun conducting retaliatory strikes. A senior Arab official and Iranian state media say several explosions have been reported near Tehran. I want to bring in Hagar Kamali. She's the former Syria and Lebanon director at the White House and former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the UN. Hagar, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've seen this before. It's not the first time Iran and Israel exchange salvos, even in this conflict. What do you think tonight's strikes mean?
You're right, Tom. You mentioned it very briefly, actually, is that this is not the first round, and I expect things to go pretty similarly to how we saw things go back in April after Iran did that first assault that we saw, where it included 300 drones and missiles. This one might be a bit stronger because Iran's recent assault against Israel was stronger, more ballistic missiles, more targeted at Israeli military sites and residential areas. So I would expect something similar. Israel has promised, notably, not to strike Iran's nuclear facilities or oil fields. And that's because they understand, on one hand, the economic implication of that, the environmental implication of that, but also because, again, there is this effort, while it's to escalate things, it's to not allow it to escalate to the point of a region-wide war. Israel has its hands full at the moment, certainly in Lebanon, and still in Gaza. Every time it winds things down in Gaza, Hamas, and it withdraws from a certain area, Hamas pops back up. This is what I would call a war of attrition, which means it's going to last a while, and you're going to have peaks and you're going to have valleys, if you will, and we're at a peak at the moment. But I do expect it to last a while. I don't expect this phase with Iran, though, to last very long. I expect Israel to finish its strikes and then to say, just like the Iranians say, to say that the case is closed at the moment.
Do you think Iran does anything else?
They might, but listen, the fact is that Iran technically has been pursuing its side of the war through its proxies. It's very happy to have the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas pursue as much as it can. They're the ones that supplied these guys with all these weapons. And that technically is Iran, and Israel certainly views it that way. And so I would see heightened response from Hezbollah and the Houthis in particular as Iran's response. But I don't expect another round of hundreds of missiles and drones, if that's what you're asking about.
What do you think happens now is, because we had this election here in the U.S., the war in Israel and Gaza and Lebanon and now Iran is only expanding more and more. Do you think anything happens more between now and Election Day in the U.S.?
I think it's only to underscore that the United States cannot really control what happens in the Middle East, and we never could. When I was at the U.S. in the White House, we always tried to pursue policies that could at least try and shape things in support of our national security objectives and peace and stability in the Middle East, and it's very difficult. That said, I would note that there are ceasefire talks that will be taking place in Qatar in 2 days. That's very important. That's something the United States has been pushing for very hard. Israel will be there, and that's to take advantage of following the death of Yahya Sinwar, former leader of Hamas, to try and push for some kind of ceasefire, even if it's temporary. And those talks I expect will continue. I think that the timing of these strikes might have been to put Israel in a stronger position of power before those talks start. And so it's hard to say what will happen, but I would look to those ceasefire talks. I wouldn't expect something explosive before the election, but again, anything can happen in the Middle East.
Hagar Kamali, we always appreciate your insight. I want to go to NBC international correspondent Matt Bradley, now in Beirut, Lebanon. Matt, get us up to speed on where the targeted attacks exactly were headed in Iran, because there's also been reporting that other strikes may have happened in other countries as well. Do we have any clarification on that?
Look, Tom, I'm going to tell you, I don't know exactly where these other strikes are happening. I don't know what's going on exactly. We don't know how much this is going to actually spread beyond just a strike by the Israelis against Iran. And that's the crucial question here. And that's the one that U.S. diplomats and diplomats throughout the world have been trying to really gauge. We don't know whether or not this is going to be some sort of symbolic strike by the Israelis against the Iranians, and whether or not this is going to create an opportunity for everybody involved to climb down off of this, or whether or not this is going to become a situation that is going to spread throughout the entire Middle East. That is something that everybody has been worried about, civilians especially, because they're the ones here in Lebanon and really in the Gaza Strip. Of course, they've been carrying the weight of this war for so long. But, we're talking about the Iranian proxy groups, because when we talk about what the Israelis are targeting, they are targeting Iran directly. And that was unprecedented back in April when there was that tit-for-tat attack between Iran and Israel. But when we're looking at this from the Israeli perspective, they see all of these different militant groups who are opposed to them and have been fighting them for so long, really generations. They see them as just identical to an Iranian attack. They see that Iran has been fighting them through these proxy groups, and they have. The Iranians have been saying that they have a axis of resistance, and these are these different different groups throughout different countries throughout the regions who are inimical to the Israelis and actually the Americans and several different Gulf states throughout the region. And so this is the question, whether or not this attack is going to escalate into something that will involve really more than just an Israel and Iran back and forth that will fly over these different countries, or whether it will actually involve warfare with these different countries that
Matt,
could wrap in all these civilians.
You bring up
a real question this early hour.
You bring up a great point as you were reporting there. Can we put that map back up? Because Matt Bradley was actually talking just about this. And though we don't have it labeled here, those other countries you're talking about include Iraq, they include Saudi Arabia, they include Jordan, Syria. Right, Syria announcing tonight they have launched their air defenses against enemies, likely citing what's happened with Israel. But you bring up a good point, saying that this wouldn't be a ground invasion. This wouldn't be a traditional war like we know other wars to be with soldiers, because I mean, at least not right now, because Iran and Israel physically are so far from each other, and so essentially this is one shot, it kind of slows down, and then Iran may fire again. But it's not continuous warfare like what we've seen in Hamas, in Gaza. And to be honest with you, Matt, where you are in Lebanon as well, where it's been, nonstop bombardments.
Yeah, I mean, it's not continuous warfare, it's strategic warfare in the way that we know. I mean, when you look at something like what we've been covering in the past, recent past, Ukraine, this is not a situation where somebody has to hold a hill or capture a city. This is a situation that's quite different, where this is about creating deterrence. It's about symbolism. It's about saying that we are firing against the enemy. And that is, in a way, a different sort of, prescription. We're not talking about an actual tactical fight. We're talking about egos. We're talking about nationalism. So the Iranians have to be able to respond to this. The Israelis are responding to create deterrence. And this was we have to remember, this is all in response to that October 1st attack by the Iranians, when they fired that huge salvo of missiles for the second time in the same year, and in a way to create deterrence, to say that the Israelis can't be bossing us around. They can't assassinate leaders of groups that are supported by the Iranians throughout the region without expecting an Iranian response. And that's why we saw that Iranian response with about 180 ballistic missiles fired back on October 1st. This is a response to that. So in a way, there is an avenue for diplomacy here, because there isn't necessarily a direct ground war between Israel and Iran. But like so many of the other wars we've seen in this century and the last, this is a war that is fought through proxies, through groups like Hezbollah here in Lebanon, through the Houthis in Yemen, through groups in Syria and Iraq, through Hamas, which is also backed by Iran. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the axis of resistance. So this is about deterrence. This is about symbolism. This is about creating an atmosphere in which one party has to back down against the other. And it really is about diplomacy. And that is why diplomacy has an avenue to stop all this.
All right, Matt Bradley for us live from Beirut. Matt, you and your team, please stay safe. It is a violent night in that region. I want to go to NBC senior national security reporter Courtney Kube. She's at the Pentagon. She's been following all of this for us. Courtney, we know Israel is one of our biggest allies in the U.S., and they have at times shared intel, maybe at times they haven't shared intel. What do you think the Department of Defense and the Pentagon is thinking right now tonight? We are, less than 2 weeks out from our election, but the situation in the Middle East is just getting hotter and hotter.
Yeah, I think the main word that they're hoping for right now is de-escalation. We should expect in the coming hours and days to hear from U.S. officials that exactly what we heard back in April, when there was this back and forth between Israel and Iran, and that was a hope that each side would respond in a proportional way until this just ends. Now, the hope leading into tonight from U.S. officials was that there was an acknowledgement that they were going to retaliate here, but that they would do that in a proportional way. Things like military targets. The big question now is that what Israel stuck to tonight? We don't have an answer to that yet, Tom. Among the other possibilities is that Israel could hit energy targets, so oil and gas fields. That would be more about hurting Iran's economy. But officials seemed pretty confident that this would be really a limited strike to military targets. Again, we don't know the answer to that. What we do know is at this point, there was no indication that the U.S. military was involved in this in any way. Of course, how the U.S. could play a role in this going forward is what we've seen in recent months, and that is the U.S. protecting Israel if, in fact, Iran or any of the proxies were to respond to this Israeli attack tonight. Now, the U.S. has a huge amount of military power in the region. In fact, we were just hearing from Matt about the back and forth between Israel and Iran back in April. Since that time, the U.S. has moved even more military in the form of manned aircraft. They have more U.S. military ships in there. And then very critically, just in the last couple of weeks, the U.S. military has put a THAAD air defense system in there. Why that's important, Tom, is this is a system that can be spread out over multiple areas. It has a huge radar aperture. It has a huge ability to see incoming from very far away. And then it has the ability to target those incoming missiles in the very end of their flight pattern. So literally in the last minutes, even seconds before an incoming missile comes in, the THAAD fires off an interceptor, takes it out before it's able to impact. This is a critical new capability. And it's not just for its ability to target those potential incoming missiles, but again, it has the ability to see very far out before a launch comes in. So what we're talking about right now is this Israeli response. But what everyone is looking to next is, does Iran retaliate again? Again, U.S. officials going into this tonight seemed pretty confident that this Israeli response, or hopefully confident that it would be somewhat proportional and it might not elicit a large Iran response. But I got to tell you, the coming hours and days will be what tells us that, Tom. Yeah,
and people have talked about this, and I know you know this, Courtney, an all-out war between Iran and Israel. And again, we want to caution that's not what this is. They are firing salvos at each other, but that's not an all-out war between Iran and Israel. That does not appear what this is. But Israel's advantage in the military front versus Iran's, which is a bit more dated, though they are making a lot of the drones that are being used in the region. But talk to me about the military might between those two countries.
Yeah, Iran, one thing, we hear a lot about Iran's nuclear capabilities, but I can't stress enough about their ballistic missile capabilities. They have a huge arsenal of ballistic missiles. The big question is just how capable and accurate are they? And that's something that analysts have been looking at since these back and forths in April, and then even more recently, Iran lobbing nearly 200 ballistic missiles at Israel only a couple of weeks ago. The vast majority of them were shot down. Some did impact, though. But the big question is just how capable are these missiles in this enormous arsenal? I think the other thing we have to keep in mind when we talk about the capabilities between these two sides is Iran has a huge proxy presence in the region. Now, Israel has really degraded that proxy presence in recent weeks and months. They have taken out large numbers of Hamas. They've taken out Hamas leadership. They have taken out, really crippled Hezbollah's leadership in Lebanon. There are other proxy groups, though, and they still have quite a capability. Those are Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq and in Syria, and then the Houthis in Yemen. So Israel, they have a very capable and large military and a huge arsenal, but the militias have a say here as well, Tom.
Courtney Kube, we appreciate all your reporting on this breaking news. Just to recap, Israel has launched retaliatory strikes against Iran. We've just gotten this in from the National Security Council. This is from the U.S. National Security Council saying, we understand that Israel is conducting targeted strikes against military targets in Iran as an exercise of self-defense and in response to Iran's ballistic missile attack against Israel on October 1st. We would refer you to the Israeli government for more information on their operation. So the U.S. Officials also confirming that strike, which NBC News has confirmed as well. Again, Israel retaliating against Iran for tonight. We think those strikes have stopped, but again, we're going to be covering the situation as it unfolds. That's the latest for us at Top Story. Stay right there. More news on the way.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.